Hey guys, so I originally was trying to record this video, but my son wanted to record it with me, but then he started doing these really funny faces, and maybe I'll include it at the end of the video as a blooper reel kind of a thing. So there might be a pause and then saying, hey, here's the blooper reel, and then you'll see the blooper reel of my son trying to do this with me. So that's why I'm kind of laughing right now. Anyways, so this is the top 10 podcasts that I personally listen to. Majority of these podcasts are very family friendly, so you can listen to them with your kids, which is a big deal for me because I like listening to music in the car, but I also listen to metal, and sometimes not all metal can be very family friendly. And sometimes I just want to listen to a podcast, you know, talking about guitar, and sometimes they're, you know, some I've had where the artists or whoever can be a little bit too much, and some of them can be very family friendly. So I'll try to preference if you're a family guy like myself, you know, saying, hey, this is a family friendly one, you could listen to this with your kids in the car, that, you know. So number 10 is the Tone Mob podcast. Now, a guy named Blake, he's out of, I believe, Portland, Oregon. Really nice guy, it seems like. He has some really good topics. He offers some really great content as far as he talks to people in the industry. He also talks to musicians in the industry about their guitar things. He has a lot of questions, a lot of great stuff. He posts pretty frequently. That's another thing I did when I was talking about this list, is that they're a frequent posters, that they're not, it hasn't been a year since they've done their last post, and he does a pretty good job about posting almost every week, and I do enjoy listening to his stuff. The next one, Guitar Talk. Now, Guitar Talk offers some really cool insight to the products. I believe it's two or three Australian guys, maybe. But he offers some really they offer some really just shorter podcasts. From what I could tell, I'm newer into their podcast. They're pretty family friendly, but they actually they do a pretty good job with going over some of the products. And it's, like I said, it's just a nice little short, sweet podcast. You know, you gotta drive to the grocery store or something, you just pop it on. Number 8, Everyone Loves Guitar. Now this guy offers some pretty cool stuff as well. He is very similar to other guitar players, like the Tone Mob and stuff like that, where they interview artists and they interview people about their guitar playing, about when they started, how they started, and stuff like that. Not 100% family friendly as far as younger kids are concerned. If you got a kid who's, you know, 16 or whatever, I'm pretty sure I'm not going to lie, I'm pretty sure he's heard swearing in his, you know, at school. I mean, this stuff has a little bit of swears, but you know what? Sometimes artists and musicians don't always have the the most proper vocabulary, we could say. Number 7, and I thoroughly do enjoy this podcast, but it isn't higher on my list because I'll explain why. Chasing Tone podcast with Brian Wampler. Now, I think this is a phenomenal podcast because Brian gets into his pedals, he gets into nitty-gritties of the pedal industry, he gets into podcasting, gets into everything. But the reason why I said it's not exactly higher on my list is because he does have a tendency to go off when he's talking. So sometimes he'll talk about food or other things, which I have no problem with. I actually like listening to that stuff. I think it's cool listening to that stuff. But if you're coming to this video because you want to know what podcasts to listen to that's going to be talking about guitar, then and you get annoyed if people go off topic, then you might be a little bit annoyed with that. But honestly, he's got some great knowledge. He's got some great stuff. I think it's absolutely phenomenal podcast. I've listened to that one for a long time now, and I've always liked it. Now, oh, and that's also a very family-friendly podcast. Now, number 6, which this one depends on the artist that they're interviewing, but it's the rig rundown from Premier Guitar. Now, everyone has seen the YouTube video of Premier Guitar rig rundown, but they do also offer an audio version of that rig rundown, which is cool, because sometimes I personally don't always have the time to listen or to watch an hour-long video, because with YouTube and work and this and that, I listen to most of my podcasts when I'm at work or when I'm in the car, and I can't always watch or listen to something when I'm at home. So the Premier Guitar, depending on the artist, can be very family friendly. Now, here's the other thing. The reason why this one isn't higher on my list is because I think there's a certain element of the video that you need to have. Like when they did the Joe Bonamassa one. Awesome video, but when you're listening to it, he's just talking about his guitars, and you're like, okay, what do they look like, you know? And then all of a sudden you watch it, and you're like, oh, wow, that's a beautiful guitar. It all depends. Number 5, No Guitar is Safe by Guitar Player. This one, I'll tell you, this one is wicked awesome. Now, No Guitar is Safe is very similar to Everyone Loves Guitar, very similar to Tone Mob. Why is it higher on the list? And it's not because it's a Guitar Player magazine thing or anything else. I'm not endorsed by any of these companies, or any of these companies asking me to do anything. Obviously, I'm a very small YouTube channel, and I just want to help out, you know, everybody. The reason why I have this a little bit higher on my list versus the other ones is because he offers not only the talking with the artist, but he sits there and the artist will actually, he'll be like, hey, remember that part in that song that you did, you know, blah, blah, and the guitarist will be like, oh yeah, I remember that. And they actually have their guitars sitting there, and they actually play over that part. And he's like, oh yeah, I did this fifth, and I did this, and I did, you know, I did this run, and I just went, you know, and it's really cool to listen to. When you're listening to that, you're like, wow, I didn't know X guitar player in this song did this, and that's why this song turned out the way it did. And it really gives you another insight to a guitar player's mind and other guitar players' minds. Now, we're down to the top 4. Now, the top 4, the fourth one in the top 4 could be higher on my list. I will say that it could be higher on my list, but I'm going to preference why it's not. That Pedal Show, their YouTube channel that they offer their audio for their channel as a podcast that you can download and listen to. The reason why it's not higher is because, how do I put this? The only complaint I have with it is that you don't always know what they're doing. You don't always know if they're changing knobs, changing guitars, changing certain things. That's not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing. It's just, it's one of those things where it's like, okay, yeah, you're talking about this fuzz pedal, this delay pedal, this whatever pedal. I don't know what your settings are. I don't know what this is or that is. But besides those negative points, it is a brilliant podcast. I mean, I just love listening to it. Just hearing them talk of the passion that they have behind playing guitar and everything, it's absolutely awesome. But honestly, it's kind of like the Premier Guitar, where I think there is a little bit of sight that needs to be involved. And that's why I put it number 4 on the list. Now, number 3 is a newer podcast that I'm getting into, but I really wanted to make it aware to you, the person, because it's called Guitar Player, or Play Guitar Podcast. I'm sorry, Play Guitar Podcast. He is a newer podcast. I think he's only done it about this year. And what's really cool is he's offering stuff that is for anyone who's a beginner to intermediate to even maybe a person who just never does certain things. Like his latest podcast is talking about guitar setups. I know how to do that. Some people know how to do that, but there are some people who pay, you know, hey, I need to get this set up. I need to have my strings changed. I remember working at a guitar shop, and we would charge, depending on the guitar, depending on the strings, everything else, it'd be anywhere from 20 all the way up to $50, depending on what. And that's just for sometimes even just string changes with a little bit of cleaning up or a little bit of setup. It's just how it is, you know. Guitar, doing that stuff gets really expensive. And, you know, he offered a really cool podcast about, hey, don't be afraid to touch your guitar. Don't be afraid to do stuff. Don't be afraid to change your strings, stuff like that. But he also had a lot of other really cool podcasts where he talks about some really good beginning points. And it's a very clean, very friendly podcast. Oh, same thing with the That Pedal Show. Very family friendly. Play Guitar podcast. Also very family friendly. Pardon me. Number two, I put as number 2 because I listen to it almost when it comes out almost instantly because I enjoy the banter on it. Now, this list is all my opinion, and the Guitar Nerds or Guitar Nerds podcast is an absolutely excellent podcast. They go over, you know, new stuff a lot. They definitely offer a good insight because I know 2 of the guys on there, one works for Fender, one works for Boss. And they offer some really good insight to the guitar world. But the difference is that they're in England, you know, so it's a little bit different, you know, when they talk about certain prices or how it is over there versus over here. You know, there is a somewhat of a difference. You know, it's not always different, but there's a little bit. But the reason why it might not be number 1 on my list is because, which I don't think is a bad thing, because I think you should offer something with their Patreon. But they offer a Patreon where in order to get certain things, you have to pay for the Patreon, which gets you those certain contents, which, like I said, it isn't a bad thing. I think it's actually a really smart thing because, I mean, it just costs a little bit extra of your time, and then you're giving the person who's supporting you financially a way to support you. So, but sometimes it kind of stinks because you'll be listening along, and then all of a sudden they're like, "Oh, we run out of time. We can't get to these questions. Well, we'll do the question on our Patreon." And you're like, "Ah, I'm not a Patreon supporter," you know, and then you don't get to hear that question because it's a wicked awesome question or a really awesome topic. So, now my number 1, the Guitar Knobs podcast. Todd, Tony from the Pick Guardian, Jared Brandon of Brandon Wound Pickups. 3 of the nicest guys, man. I'll tell you. I got to deal with all of them on different levels. I dealt with Jared Brandon for some pickup stuff. I dealt with Pick Guardian once for some pickguard stuff. It didn't work out, unfortunately, because it was a obscure thing and I didn't really have the money at the time. But Todd also, you know, really nice guy. And it's not just because, I mean, I've supported these guys almost since the beginning. I went back and looked at the first episode I ever listened to from them, and it was, I think, maybe within the single digits, almost double digits. And they just offer some really great stuff. They're very frequent posters, and they're really nice guys. They're just genuine people. They're not fake. They're not playing something off, and they talk to the industry. They talk to people in the industry, and they really offer a great insight. And I can't say enough nice things about this podcast because I can listen to them in my car with my kids. I can enjoy the show. I wish there were more podcasts. Because I just thoroughly enjoy it a lot, and I wish they were longer sometimes, but you know, I do thoroughly like the Guitar Knobs podcast. So if you're out there and you want to listen to some podcasts about guitar stuff, hopefully this list helps you. I think every person on this list offers something that's beneficial. I will say that there are some podcasts out there that I listen to that, you know what, the guys on there were just getting drunk, and I didn't think that was great, you know. I had one podcast where they're actually making fun of somebody because it was a beginner and they're asking a question about guitar setups, and it just completely turned me off that podcast of that. It was the same podcast where the people were getting drunk as well, and they're revered as a very highly revered podcast, and I kind of just, it always makes me cringe every time I think about it. I'm not going to say who they are, but every single podcast here offers something beneficial to the guitar player, to you, even to your family. My kids sometimes love listening to certain ones of these where they talk about certain guitar things, you know. So, happy 2018. Happy 2019. We'll see you in the new year. Take care, guys. Be safe. Be healthy. Be happy. Smile. That's Liam. This is my youngest little guy. He's going to do the video with me today. And we're going to talk about the top 10 guitar podcasts. You're going to be funny through the whole video. This is probably the last video I'm going to do of 2018. Hey. You stop that. But this is probably the last video I'm going to do for 2018. So, I'm going to try to make this quick because this little guy, I don't know how much longer he's going to last. Number 10. Oh, and I'm going to preference these top 10 podcasts are active podcasts. And what I mean by active is that they have posted as of recently and as of within a certain amount, showing off for the camera, and as of a certain amount of time, meaning that if the last podcast that they posted was in 2017, I didn't include it. If the last podcast you posted was at the beginning of this year, I didn't include it. If you post once a month, you could be on here. I don't, you know, but it's just one of those things where I wanted the podcast to be active podcast. Number 10, I should say. The 10th podcast I have on here. Oh, and I want to preference too that most of these podcasts can be family friendly. I'm gonna sit right here. You're gonna sit right here? Okay. And that's why I have my little guy with me, because he actually listens to some of these podcasts with me. Can't block the camera, buddy. I gotta do the video, okay?
I just want to slide that signal.
I know. What are you doing? Okay, so number 10 is the Tone Mob podcast. Blake from the Tone Mob podcast, he talks to a lot of great people, and he has some really cool stuff. Talks to artists. He talks to he talks to